Hello, and welcome to lesson 19 of this basic biblical Greek course. I really cannot fully articulate how excited I am about today's lesson because today we are looking at a new mood, specifically the subjunctive mood. So we're going to talk about the subjunctive mood, do an overview. We're also going to learn about the various forms and how to translate the various tenses. And then we'll look at subjunctive mood clues to help us to recognize subjunctive verbs. We'll also talk about something called emphatic negation in the subjunctive. And then lastly, we will look at some new vocabulary and do some translation work together, practicing the subjunctive mood. So I hope that you're as excited as I am to learn the subjunctive mood. So if you've got your tea or coffee, warm it up and let's get going. So I'd like to begin this lesson by doing an overview of the Greek moods. So let me just remind you that there are four moods in Greek. We have the indicative, the subjunctive, the imperative, and the optative. So far, we have only been focusing on the indicative mood, which occurs about 15,000 times in the Greek New Testament, far more than any of the other moods. And we've learned that the indicative mood represents something as certain or asserted. So the example that we used previously was he went fishing. Today, we are starting a new chapter in this biblical Greek course because we are introducing a new mood into our learning, and that is the subjunctive mood, which occurs about 2,000 times in the Greek New Testament. And the subjunctive mood, as we are going to learn, represents something as probable. So the example here, building on the fishing analogy, we could say, whenever he goes fishing. And then in a few lessons time, we will also look at the imperative mood, which occurs about 1,500 times. And then we will just briefly look at the optative mood because as you can see here, it occurs very infrequently in the New Testament. There's only about 70 occurrences of it. And we will look at some more specific examples of that in due time. Right, so in this lesson, we are going to zero in and look more carefully at the subjunctive mood together. Before we zoom in on the details of the subjunctive mood, let's take a step back so that we can give ourselves a big picture overview of what the subjunctive mood is about. And let's begin with this first point. Whereas the indicative mood describes a real statement, such as, I want to learn Greek, the subjunctive mood describes what may or might happen. I might learn Greek if I worked hard. So the subjunctive mood describes an action as probable, and hence it is the mood of probability. Lastly, we could say that because the action described in the subjunctive mood is still unfulfilled, it often deals with something that might take place in the future. So if I make the statement, I might learn Greek if I worked hard, the realization of the goal of learning Greek is dependent on whether I fulfill the condition of working hard. So there's no certainty that I actually might learn Greek. It is probable and it is unfulfilled until a future time based on whether I meet the conditions. All right, so I hope that you're just beginning to glean the difference between the indicative mood and the subjunctive mood. The indicative is a mood of assertion, making a claim, and there's a degree of certainty about it. The subjunctive mood, there's a degree of uncertainty because it describes a future event that might or might not actually take place. So let's take some time now to speak about the relationship of verbal aspect and time to the subjunctive mood. So far, we have learned that both aspect and time are significant in the indicative mood. So within the framework of verbal aspect being the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a verb, we have tense form and time. So there are 6 tense forms in Greek: the present, future, imperfect, aorist, perfect, and pluperfect. And in the indicative mood, these tense forms correspond to relevant times. So the present tense form relates to an action in the present time, the future tense form to an action in the future time, and the imperfect, the aorist, the perfect, and the pluperfect tense forms relate to actions that have happened in the past. However, in the subjunctive mood, time becomes insignificant. So whereas time was significant in the indicative mood, it's now insignificant in the subjunctive mood. So what we can actually do now is we can cross out this column because it doesn't have any bearing on the subjunctive mood. And that is undergirded by the fact that there is no concept of absolute time in the subjunctive mood. Now only the aspect becomes significant. All right, so that is one of the biggest differences between the indicative mood and the subjunctive mood. In the subjunctive mood, we now are going to give our primary attention to the aspect and not to time. Let's quickly speak about the tense forms in the subjunctive. So because time is not significant, the subjunctive mood requires only 3 tenses, namely the present, the aorist, and the perfect tenses. However, the perfect occurs only 10 times in the New Testament. And so because it's very rare, we are going to focus primarily on the present and aorist tense forms in the subjunctive mood. Now, you might have asked yourself the question, where is the future tense form in the subjunctive mood? And in answering this question, it's perhaps best to compare it to the indicative mood. So the future indicative usually indicates something that will take place. And the example there comes from 1 John 3 verse 2, which in the ESV reads as follows: Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, listen closely to this, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. So there John uses the future indicative mood, and he's conveying something that is certain and will take place in the future. However, the subjunctive mood often deals with something that might take place in the future. And because there is an air of uncertainty, there is no future tense form in the subjunctive mood. So before we learn the tense forms together, let us take a look at the characteristics of the subjunctive mood. Now, the subjunctive mood has 2 key characteristics, and I just want to encourage you to memorize these 2 characteristics, because if you do so, they are going to put you in good stead going forward. So the first one is that it uses only primary endings for all its tenses. It uses only primary endings for all its tenses. So in the subjunctive mood, there are no secondary endings. So these two tables are a summary of the primary endings. So let's just remind ourselves of the primary active endings. The singular endings are the first person, there's no ending. Second person, we have sigma. Third person, we have iota. The plural endings are men, te, and nc. Now, just regarding that third person plural, even though this is the true ending, and I would encourage you to learn it, the actual modified ending is perhaps easier to learn and to think of, and that modified ending is uc with the movable nu. That's how we always find it in the New Testament. All right, so just keep that in the back of your mind. And then the primary middle passive endings, the singulars are my, psi, and tai. And then the plural endings are metha, iste, and in tai. And then the second key characteristic of the subjunctive mood, it always has a lengthened connecting vowel. So in the indicative mood, we had the omicron and the epsilon connecting vowels. So in the subjunctive mood, the omicron lengthens to an omega and the epsilon will lengthen to an eta. Right, so guys, learn these two characteristics that are going to help you to learn the tense forms of the subjunctive mood. Now that we have learned the characteristics of a subjunctive mood, let us now take a look at the components of the present subjunctive verbs. So I hope that this is good news. The good news that the subjunctive mood uses the same endings as the indicative. So the present tense also uses primary endings with a lengthened vowel. So the components of the present subjunctive verb look like this. Our tense stem is lu once again. Then we have the lengthened connecting vowels, which should either be the omega or the eta. There is no tense formative for the present subjunctive. And then it takes primary endings. So it's now time to learn the present subjunctive verb endings. But in teaching you these verb endings, I'd like to do it by comparing the present indicative with the subjunctive. So before we do so, I just want you to keep an eye out for those two characteristics. The first one being the primary endings, and the second one, the lengthened connecting vowels. So on the left-hand side here, we have the present active indicative verb endings. So by now you should have memorized these endings. We have luo, luace, lua, luamen, luete, and luusin. So let's move across now to the present active subjunctive verb endings. So let me say them for you first. We have luo, luace, lua. The plural endings, we have luomen, luete, and luosin. So what you'll notice by comparing these two moods is that the first person singulars are both the same. So the only way you're going to distinguish between them is by the context in which you find them. And as we're going to see later, there are some clues that also assist us with drawing a distinction between them. And then I've highlighted the lengthened connecting vowels. So you see the second person singular, we had the diphthong, the epsilon iota. So that now has become an eta with a iota subscript. So we don't lose the iota, it becomes a subscript underneath the lengthened vowel. The third person singular, we had the diphthong epsilon iota, and that now has become an eta with the iota subscript as well. And then the first person plural, we had lu amen. The omicron is lengthened now to the omega. The second person plural, we had luete, the epsilon has lengthened to the eta. And the third person plural, we had luusi, and there we had a diphthong, the omicron upsilon, and that now is replaced by the omega. All right, so those are the lengthened connecting vowels, and then once again we keep the primary endings. Let's move on now to the present middle passive. Look at the indicative first. The singulars, we have luamai, luae, luetai. The plurals, we have luametha, lueste, and luontai. Let's now look at the present middle passive subjunctives. So the singular forms, we have luomai, luae, luetai. The plurals, we have luometha, luaesthe, and luontai. All right, so once again, we have the primary endings with the lengthened connecting vowels. And then you can also see there that the second person singulars are the same. And once again, you'll only be able to distinguish these from the context in which they are found. As we begin to look at the translation of the subjunctive mood, I acknowledge that it's going to seem a little confusing to you at first. But I just want to encourage you to hang in there, and hopefully after we've gone through all the tense forms, it'll make more sense to you. So let's begin with the translation of the present active subjunctive. Because we're still dealing with the imperfective verbal aspect, we're going to translate the present active subjunctive using the imperfective verbal aspect, which conveys an ongoing or linear action. So let's look at the singular forms first. So we have the first person singular luo, which we're going to translate as I may, might, should be loosing. Now, depending on the context in which you are doing the translation work, you would have to decide which word is more appropriate, either may, might, or should. But all of these are words that help us to express or convey the subjunctive idea of the verb. And then we need to include the word be in the present tense form to show that the action is ongoing or linear. Let's move on to the second person singular, luas. We would translate this as you may be loosing. Third person singular, luae. He may be loosing. The first person plural, luomen. We may be loosing. Second person plural, luete. You may be loosing. And then the third person plural, luosin. They may be loosing. Let's learn now how to translate the present middle passive subjunctives. As you can see here, that the forms are the same for both voices. So let's begin with the middle voice and then move on to the passive voice. So the first person singular, luomai, with the middle voice we would translate as I may be loosing for myself. Luae, you may be loosing for yourself. And luetai, he may be loosing for himself. And then the plural forms, luometha, we may be loosing for ourselves. Luaesthe, you may be loosing for yourselves. And then the third person plural, luontai, they may be loosing for themselves. All right, so I think the middle voice is quite straightforward. The passive voice is probably going to seem quite foreign to you initially, but let's go through it together. The first person singular, luomai, we would translate as I may be being loosed. As you can see here, we use the helping word being to convey the passive voice to show that the subject is receiving the action of the verb. Then luae, you may be being loosed. Luetai, he may be being loosed. Then the plural forms, first person, luo metha, we may be being loosed. Luaste, you may be being loosed. And then the third person plural, luontai, they may be being loosed. Good work. Let's keep moving on. And now let's learn the components of the aorist subjunctive verbs. So the aorist subjunctive also uses primary endings. This means that the aorist subjunctive uses exactly the same personal endings as the present subjunctive. All right, so this is going to have to settle in your mind initially, because you are used to learning the aorist with secondary endings. But now in the subjunctive mood, the aorist also takes primary endings, and therefore it's going to look the same as the present subjunctive. The only difference, however, will be the tense formative, which is the sigma, not the sigma alpha, just an individual sigma. So don't confuse this with the future tense though. Remember that the tense formative of the future indicative is also a sigma. But now in the aorist subjunctive, the tense formative is also a sigma. Then, unlike the indicative mood, because the subjunctive mood does not indicate absolute past time, there is no augment. And then lastly, just as the aorist passive indicative uses active endings, so also the aorist passive subjunctive uses active endings. So the components of the aorist subjunctive verb will look something like this. The tense stem is lu. Then we also have the lengthened connecting vowels, omega and the eta. The tense formative is a sigma, and then they take primary personal endings. So in order to teach you the first aorist subjunctive forms, I'd like to compare them to the present subjunctive forms because they are so similar. So let's quickly do some revision of the present active and the present middle passive subjunctive forms. So the singulars for the present active are luo, luace, luae, and the plurals luomen, luate, luosin. And then the present middle passive, we have luomai, luae, luatai, luometha, luaste, and luontai. So now when we move over to the first aorist active subjunctive and the first aorist middle subjunctive, you will notice right away that the endings are exactly the same because they both take primary endings. The only difference, as you can see there, is that the first aorist active and the first aorist middle subjunctive forms are characterized by the tense formative, the sigma. So that's the only thing that distinguishes them. So learning the first aorist shouldn't be too difficult initially, because if you know the present subjunctive forms, then it's a matter of just adding the sigma or recognizing the sigma when you see it in the text. However, the first aorist first passive forms are not characterized by the tense formative, the sigma, as we're going to see. So what I'd like to do now is first remind ourselves of the first aorist first passive indicative forms. So let's go through these forms together very quickly. The singulars, we have eleuthein, eleuthes, eleuthae. The plural forms, eleuthemen, eleuthaete, and eleuthaeson. So remember, in the indicative mood, time is significant, so that is why we have the augments on the front. And then the first passive in the indicative mood is characterized by the tense formative, the theta eta. All right, now as we move over to the first aorist, first passive subjunctive, you'll notice that the first big difference is that there are no augments, and that is because in the subjunctive mood, remember, time is not significant. The second thing that you'll notice is that whereas in the indicative mood we had the theta eta, we now only have the tense formative the theta, which is the key to recognizing the first passive. And then the last difference is that the first aorist, first passive subjunctive forms take primary active endings, all right, which I've highlighted there in red for you. So let's go through them very quickly. The singulars, we have lutho, luthase, luthae. The plural forms, luthomen, luthete, and luthosin. All right, so learning the first aorist forms are going to be tricky at first because we are used to seeing secondary endings, but in the subjunctive mood, they take primary endings. So now that we've done the first aorist subjunctive forms, we also need to do the second aorist subjunctive forms. And rest assured, they are not that difficult. So the first comment here is that the second aorist active and middle subjunctive verbs are formed exactly like the present tense, except for the characteristic stem change. So take a look here. Here we have the present active subjunctive. So we're working with the stem lu, because lu is regular and doesn't change. So we have luo, luase, luae, luomen, luate, and luosin. But now for the second aorist active, you can see there that we have the exact same primary active endings, the o, the ace, the a, the omen, the ate, and the osin. The only difference is that in the second aorist we have the stem change. That's why instead of using lu, we once again use lip to remind ourselves of the stem change that takes place. And then the present middle passive subjunctive, the forms are luomai, luae, luatai, luometha, luaste, and luontai. And the second aorist middle once again takes the primary middle passive endings, and instead of using the regular stem lu, we use lip to indicate the stem change. All right, so that shouldn't be too difficult to learn, as long as you keep in mind the second aorist, the stem will undergo a stem change. So let us now learn how to translate the first aorist active subjunctive forms. Just remember that the second aorist active is translated the same way. So we are going to translate these verbs using the perfective verbal aspect, which conveys a whole or entire action. So i.e., we're not focusing on its beginning, progression, culmination, or results. So the first person singular, luso, we would translate as I may loose. Remember, you can also use words such as might or should. In the meantime, depending on what best fits the context. In the second person singular, luces, you may loose. Third person singular, luce, he may loose. Lusomen, we may loose. Lucete, you may loose. And then lusosin, they may loose. Now let's look at translating the first aorist middle subjunctive. And once again, the second aorist middle is translated the same way. So the first person singular, lusomai, we have I may loose for myself. Lusei, you may loose for yourself. Lusetai, he may loose for himself. The plural forms, lusometha, we may loose for ourselves. Lusaste, you may loose for, should be yourselves. And then lusontai, they may loose for themselves. And then lastly, let us look at how to translate the first aorist first passive subjunctive forms. Just two notes here very quickly before we go through them. The first one is that the second aorist, first passive, is translated the same way. And just remember that the only difference between the first and second passives is essentially the presence or the omission of the theta. All right. However, the translations are the same regarding the tenses. So the first person singular, lutho, we would translate as I may be loosed. All right. So here the helping verb be helps us to convey the passive voice to show that the subject is receiving the action of the verb. Then we have lutheis, you may be loosed. Luthei, he may be loosed. Then luthomen, we may be loosed. Luthete, you may be loosed. And then luthosin, they may be loosed. Let's move on to the next section of this lesson, which has to do with clues to help identify subjunctive verbs. Now, if you remember, when we're learning the present subjunctive forms, we saw that there were one or two forms that were identical to the indicative mood. And we said that one way that we can distinguish between the indicative and the subjunctive forms is by looking at the context in which they're found. But a more helpful way to distinguish between the indicative and the subjunctive is to look for specific clues within the text itself. So I want to introduce you to those clues now. So the first two are the clues which are technically called particles, and they are eon and hina. So when you see eon or hina in a verse, then that should trigger some warning bells in your mind that the following verb will probably be in the subjunctive mood. So let's look at an example that comes from 1 John 1 verse 9. And the first portion of the verse uses the clue eon, which I have highlighted there in red for you. And then to show you that the verb that comes directly afterwards, the verb is homologomen. To show you that it's in the subjunctive mood, I've highlighted that in blue. So this is a promise, and one that I personally claim almost every single day of my life, where I ask the Lord to forgive me for my sins and to cleanse me from all my unrighteousness. And maybe you do as well, but you might never have known that John has written this in the subjunctive mood. So we generally translate this as if we confess our sins. But now that you know how to translate the subjunctive, we could also perhaps use a word like should. If we should confess our sins. If we may confess our sins. And that just conveys that that this is conditional. That yes, Jesus has paid for our sins on the cross of Calvary, but in terms of our daily walk with the Lord, our daily relationship with Him, that there are going to be times when we offend Him, and the Lord wants us to be open and honest about those sins and to acknowledge them before Him by confessing them to Him. And then in the second half of the verse, there's another clue, which is hina. So there I've highlighted the clue in red, hina, and the verb that comes directly afterwards, aphe, to show you that it is also in the subjunctive mood, I have highlighted in blue, and we translate that as to forgive our sins. So now that you know the clues hina and eon, there are also other words, mostly formed by a combination with the particle on, that also serve as clues for helping us to identify verbs in the subjunctive mood. So those are words like hoton, which is a combination of hote plus on, which we translate as whenever. Then we have hos on, whoever, hopu on, wherever, heos, which is until, and heos on, until. Right, so all these variations, these combinations of on are further clues to help us identify the subjunctive mood. So here's an example from Mark 3 verse 29. So we have ha on. So I've highlighted that clue in red and we've translated that as whoever. And then we have the verb blasphemase, which we translate as blasphemes. And to show that that is in the subjunctive mood, I've highlighted that in blue. All right, so these clues are very, very helpful for identifying the subjunctive mood. Let's move on to the next section of this lesson, which has to do with negation in the subjunctive mood. So the basic rule is that u, which is a particle, is used to negate a verb in the indicative mood, while may is used to negate everything else, including the subjunctive. Right, so you won't find u outside of the indicative mood, and outside the indicative mood, you will always find the negative particle may. Now, there is one specific construction using the subjunctive mood that needs to be stressed, and that construction is called emphatic negation. So what does this refer to? Emphatic negation is expressed by the double negative u may plus the aorist subjunctive. So when you see a biblical author using this formula, as it were, u, the indicative particle, plus may, the non-indicative negative particle, plus the aorist subjunctive, then they are expressing what we call emphatic negation. All right, so as its name suggests, this type of negation is emphatic and strongly denies that something will happen. In fact, as I've said to you, it is the strongest way to negate a statement in Greek. So about 90% of the occurrences of emphatic negation are found in the sayings of Jesus and in some citations from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, these emphatic negations are often translated with the following phrases or words: never, certainly not, or absolutely not. So here's one example from the Gospels, specifically from Matthew 5 verse 20. To show you the emphatic negation, we have u plus may plus a aorist subjunctive, which is eis elthete. So that combination shows you that Jesus was using emphatic negation. I don't know if he would call it that, but he was enforcing that something cannot happen. All right, something will not happen. So that's why we translate it with a very strong negation, a very strong negative. You will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Subjunctive, subjunctive, a mood of contingency, prohibitions, wishes, or questions. When translating to English, should, could, would, or might are best, mainly in present and aorist. Subjunctive. The sign of subjunctive is a lengthened thematic vowel. O, ace, a, omen, a to osine, o my, a tie, o metha, ace the on tie, lengthened vowels with primary ending, subjunctive. Now aorist subjunctive has no epsilon augment, and the active and middle suffix is just a sigma. Aorist passive suffix is theta, but some words reject that theta, and the passive takes the active ending, subjunctive. Now some things you need to know.
There are some tricky forms.
Second aorist subjunctive, recognized by their stem forms. Also contract verbs often look the same in form. Present, indicative, and subjunctive look identical.
Only context will tell.
There are little clue words for upcoming dependent clauses. Hopos or hina, or a relative pronoun. Hos, hotan, hehos, akri, makri, ean, or kan, and may the negative too. All may tell you.
Subjunctive is coming soon.
The sign of subjunctive is a lengthened thematic vowel. O, ace, a, omen, eta, osin, o my, a tai, o metha, ace, the ontai. Lengthened vowels with primary ending. Subjunctive, subjunctive, subjunctive.
So our first word for today is daimonion, daimonion, ta, which means demon. Then we have the particle eon, which, if you remember, is one of our clues for recognizing subjunctive verbs. So we translate that as if. Then we have erotao, erotao, which is I ask or I request. So you've already learnt a word aiteo, which also means I ask. So this is more of a applied way of saying, can I have something? So it's a request. Then we have euangelizomai, euangelizomai, which can be translated loosely as I preach, proclaim, or I bring good news. Then we have theoreo, theoreo, which is I behold. Then we have thronos ha, throne. Then we have our another clue, hina, which we can translate as in order to, or in order that, so that, to, depending on the context. Then we have karpos ha, which is fruit. Next we have lithos ha, which is stone. Then we have may, which is our negative particle, which we translate as no or not in the subjunctive mood. Next we have hapu, which is where. Then we have ophthalmos ha, from which we get our English ophthalmology, which is the study of eyes. So we know that our vocab is eye. Then we have karahe, which is joy. So let's take a look at principal parts 4, 5, and 6 for today. So the first word is aineo, which means praise. And remember that there are 6 tenses for principal parts. We have the present, future active middle, aorist active middle, aorist passive, perfect active, and perfect middle passive, which I would encourage you to memorize. So the present form is aineo. Then we have aineso, ainesa, ainethane, aineka, and ainemai. Our next word is haireo, which is choose. All right, let me go through the forms with you. We have haireso, hailon, hairethane, haireka, and hairemai. All right, so it's quite difficult to pronounce because it has a rough breathing mark as well. And then our last principal part for today comes from the word airo, which is take up, aro, era, erthane, erka, and ermai. So our first translation reads as follows: Ha Jesus autos elucitai hina sose hemas upper ton hamartion hemon kai agage hemas eis zoen aonion. So our translation goes as follows: Jesus himself will come in order that he might save us from our sins and might lead us into eternal life. So this makes some observations here. Now, the first one is regarding this third person personal pronoun. It agrees with the subject, ha Jesus, in case, gender, number. So it's functioning emphatically. That's why we translate it with the English himself. And then this verb over here, elucitai, can be quite tricky. It actually comes from the deponent verb erkamai, and it has an irregular future stem. So this is a deponent future, and that principal part is actually elu samai. All right, so that's where elucitai comes from, and we translate it as will come. And then we have hina. Beep, beep, beep. This should start triggering warning bells in your mind that the subjunctive is coming. So we translate hina here as in order that, and then we have the subjunctive verb so say. And so say comes from zozo, and this here is a first aorist active subjunctive third person singular verb, and we translate it here as he might save. All right, so the emphasis here on the helping word might to show the subjunctive mood. And then there's another subjunctive verb in this text, and it's this word agage. Agage. Now, this one might be tricky to recognize. Its lexical root is ago, but this verb is based off its modified stem, agagon. So let me just write it here. Agagon, if you don't recognize it. And it is a second aorist, so second aorist, active, subjunctive, third person, singular. And we translate that as might lead. All right, we're using the helping word might again. All right, so I hope that just gives you a good introduction to helping you to recognize the clues and just some passing work regarding the subjunctive verbs. So let's read our second example together. We have eon, tis, zete, ton, theon, heuresetai, auton, kai, axe, alus, pros, auton, hina, sotho, sin. All right, so our translation would look something like this. If anyone should be seeking God, he will find him for himself and will lead others to him in order that they might be saved. Let's make one or two observations here. It starts off with eon, beep, beep, beep. The subjunctive is coming. So our first subjunctive verb here is zete. This comes from zeteo. So if we had to pass zete, this is a present, active, subjunctive, third person, singular. So that is why we translated with the imperfective verbal aspect, if anyone should be seeking. Right, so it's very important that we include be to convey the linear or progressive idea of the seeking of the verb. Then the next word that I want to look at here is heuristetai, and this actually comes from heurisco. So this is a future, middle, indicative, third person singular. All right, so that's why we translated as he will find. All right, then we've got auton, which is the direct object, find him, but then we add the words for himself to communicate the middle voice of the verb. And then let's quickly take a look at this second last word, hina. So once again, beep, 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 the subjunctive is coming, and it does come. So we have a subjunctive verb, so, tho, sin, and this comes from sozo once again. And notice here the tense formative, the theta, to show us that this is a passive, has a passive voice. So if we had to pass this, this is a first aorist, first passive, subjunctive, third person plural. And that is why we translate it as they might be saved.